Going beyond the headlines. Asking the questions you want answered. Exploring government policies and how they impact you. We are delving deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Delving Deeper. I'm your host, Sonolala. Joining us this evening are Senator the Honorable Reginald Armour, SC, the Attorney General and the Minister of Legal Affairs, the Honorable Ayanna Webster-Roy, the Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs, and Mrs. Farzana Nazir-Mohammed. She is the Director of the Criminal Justice Unit at the Office of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Delving Deeper.
Good evening, Sunil.
So today we're going to focus primarily on the upcoming national public consultations as it relates to domestic violence, which I understand is titled The Need for Greater Protection. Ms. Mohammed, I want to start with you in particular to define domestic violence and tell us, is it actually limited to physical abuse and relations between adults in the home?
So, Sunil, actually it's not that limiting. Traditionally and commonly, we know of domestic violence taking place between persons in an intimate relationship and that relationship having some sort of physical abuse happening. But legislatively and in reality, domestic violence is quite comprehensively defined in our Domestic Violence Act of 1999 as amended. Domestic violence is defined as including physical, sexual, emotional or psychological and financial abuse committed by a perpetrator, the respondent, against a person who is in a domestic relationship with the respondent. And the domestic relationship is also broadly defined to ensure that it encapsulates a wide range of arrangements as well as persons. So it includes cohabitants, spouses, former spouses, children, relatives, dependents, and even includes siblings. And we're aware of situations where siblings may be involved in a land dispute, for example, and there may be domestic violence situations in those instances. So essentially, domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago is very broadly defined, and it encapsulates a wide range of persons and relationships.
Tell us about some of the work that your institution has done for this growing issue of domestic violence.
So my team, the Criminal Justice Unit, that works directly under the Office of the Attorney General, we are responsible for legal and policy reform in the justice sector and legal advice to the Honorable Attorney General. We're also spearheading collaborations and consultations with several agencies in the justice sector. So the Domestic Violence Act was amended in the year 2020. And there were a host of significant amendments included in that law. For example, now the court can order electronic monitoring to be included as part of a protection order. There's also mandatory reporting by persons if they see domestic violence taking place. So there were significant amendments happening in 2020. But what is needed is a review, a consistent review of the legislation, because legislation must be always speaking. We must be able to respond to our current realities and the circumstances that exist now. So since 2020, the team has been looking at, one, whether the legislation is fully implemented, what are the gaps, and also what amendments are needed to ensure that the legislation is robust and current. We also have been paying attention to High Court rulings on this matter. And the team has also been collaborating with international partners. So for example, the Spotlight Initiative, which was launched in 2017, is an initiative whereby the aim is for, by the year 2030, for there to be an elimination of gender-based violence against women and girls in particular. And my team was responsible for spearheading a social media campaign to sensitize the public on what domestic violence is, the various forms of domestic violence, how to seek help and assistance. And that sort of collaboration with stakeholders is an ongoing process. And I would add finally, Sunil, that my team is spearheading the consultation under the instruction and direction of the Attorney General, and the aim is to ensure that the consultation is not a one-off conversation. We will take lead responsibility in corralling all the agencies, the justice justice sector agencies and having an action group, identifying what the gaps are and ensuring within a specific time frame that each agency fulfills its responsibility under the law and each agency delivers on the promises that are made at that consultation on the 25th.
I know that consultation is going to happen very soon, Wednesday to be precise, at the Hyatt. But in terms of, we always hear about physical abuse, and when we talk about domestic violence, but how prevalent is other forms of it, or is it that physical abuse that's still at the top?
I think, Sunil, that physical abuse gets the majority of the coverage by the media or even on social media. But based on the statistics that we have from the police service, each year there are varying forms of domestic violence that are being reported to the police that averages in the thousands per year over the last 5 years. And this can be even breach of protection orders, this can be child abuse. So there are a range of circumstances that are reported to the police, but certainly physical abuse is the most common type of abuse that we hear about.
Minister Webster-Roy, I want to turn the conversation to you in terms of to tell us what are some of the interventions or the resources for support that are available for some of these victims of domestic violence?
Thank you, Sunil. So the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs is the principal agent in the National Gender Machinery in Trinidad and Tobago. We just said about the Spotlight Initiative. One of the key activities coming out of Spotlight was a review and the development of a national strategic action plan to end gender-based violence and sexual violence in Trinidad and Tobago. Now that action plan, which we call the NSAP, represents for the first time a very comprehensive, coordinated and integrated response nationally to domestic violence and sexual violence and all forms of gender-based violence in Trinidad and Tobago. What the NSAP does is that it allows all agencies, including civil society, including private sector, to understand their responsibility and their role in the response to gender-based violence. Now, coming out of NSAP, there are a number of action items. And interestingly enough, the review of legislation was one of the action items in the NSAP. Some of the things that we have done thus far is to ramp up the support through our 800 Safe Domestic Violence Hotline in response to some of our clients who we would have seen presenting again at our shelters or even at other shelters. We recognize there's a need for financial support and the financial empowerment of survivors of gender-based violence, specifically domestic violence. The Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child Affairs would have established the Survivors Transformation and Empowerment Program. This program allows civil society to receive support as well as survivors and victims of domestic violence, and not only women, because you recognize that men too are sometimes victims. Now through STEP, there's the opportunity for civil society organizations to receive grant funding up to $50,000 to provide training for persons who would have been victims or survivors of domestic violence. The other aspect of STEP is the opportunity for the victims or survivors themselves to receive a scholarship up to $10,000 towards helping them either pursue a business or pursue training to help them to establish a business. And then the other aspect of that is the grant funding, which allows them to put it to use towards either enhancing an existing business or establish one. Another response that we have coming out of the Gender and Child Affairs Division would be our domestic violence shelter. Admittedly, we don't have enough spaces in the country, and we are working to establish more shelters. However, we have been collaborating with the NGO sector in terms of them providing shelter spaces, but in terms of what government has in at our facility, we are able to cater to women as well as their children from 18 years and under, both boys and girls. Traditionally, shelters would only accept a mother with her daughters, not her sons, but we recognize the need to keep the family together, especially the women with their children. So we have both boys and girls accompanying the mother to the shelter. We are working towards establishing a shelter for men in Trinidad and Tobago. We are in constant communication and collaboration with our partners within civil society. We are working again on establishing a men's bureau. We recognize that in addressing issues around domestic violence, you can't just look at the persons who are the core victims, but you also have to put systems in place to address those who may be the perpetrators. And admittedly, the statistics would show that women are predominantly the victims. And in establishing our men's view, we are helping our men in Trinidad and Tobago to address all issues affecting them and helping to change mindset. That is one of our key focus, changing mindset. And that is why we have been going out into communities, partnering with different agencies to ramp up public education and sensitization. So we have gone out and met with ministries, the local government representatives. We've gone to Tobago, engaged the Tobago House of Assembly, provided them with the information, and also empowering organizations to know how to respond. But one of the key messages I want to share is that there must be an all-of-society approach. Government cannot do it alone. We need every citizen to recognize their role in the response to domestic violence, and we need all hands on deck.
You talked about men, and I know it's predominantly women who are affected, but how prevalent is this? I mean, we hear stories of men going to the police station and reporting this issue of domestic violence and being shunned away somewhat. How prevalent it is, and how prevalent does it continue to be?
Well, because, as you would have intimated, they tend to be shunned, most men would not report, so we will not have a true picture of what is happening. But anecdotal evidence would suggest that it is quite prevalent in Trinidad and Tobago. Recently, at a constituency level, we had an initiative called Hang Jack in Tobago East, where we provided a safe space for men to come together. So they were cooking, playing God, and discussing issues. I didn't attend because it was a safe space for men. But the feedback that came to my constituency office indicated that it is a real problem, because men were indicated we need a safe space, some place where we could come and ventilate the issues, because we are being victims and society isn't recognizing that men are victims as well. Most of the time the conversation focuses on women, and rightly so, but it is a real issue in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is why we have recently had our workshop for men, bringing men into a safe space in Trinidad at the Government Campus Plaza, helping them to come together, discuss issues, and help us to shape how this men's bureau look like and how it responds to the issues affecting men. Because as I said before, we need a whole of society approach. We need men, women, boys and girls in the response to domestic violence and gender-based violence. Another initiative that I want to really stress on is the opportunity we have provided to vulnerable women through our Women's Village. One of the key things that we recognize, as I would have mentioned before, a number of women were re-entering our shelter or entering to another shelter because they were financially dependent on the perpetrators. Now, in establishing the Women's Village, we gave our clients, and even just women out there in Trinidad and Tobago, the opportunity to become financially empowered. Women had the opportunity to expose their businesses. If they didn't have a business, to network with agencies to help to establish a business. But most importantly, it brought women together for a common cause. So they were able to support each other. To date, over 200 women would have participated in our villages thus far. We've had a women's village in San Fernando, in Macoya, in Chaguanas, in Tobago, and we will soon head into Diego Martin.
You would have touched on my other question in terms of challenges with resources, in terms of what you talked about the shelter. Is there any other challenges, financial or otherwise, in terms of dealing with domestic violence?
I must say, we have been very fortunate. The Minister of Finance has been very generous. So Gender and Child Affairs, we have had our projects or initiatives funded and supported. And at times where government may not be able to meet the expenses, we have had the full support of our international partners. So for example, a lot of the work that we do in terms of public education and sensitization, we receive support from the UN system, from various embassies and high commissions in Trinidad and Tobago. As a matter of fact, we're working on an initiative called the Women, Peace and Security, where we're trying to establish an action plan to treat with peace and security and gun violence in Trinidad and Tobago. And we have received tremendous support from the Canadian government in terms of technical support and financial support. One of the things that I want to point out, When we make resources available and they aren't accessed, that is a challenge. So for example, STEP, the Survivors Transformation and Empowerment Program, we have been going out into communities and advertising and encouraging persons to apply, and yet we're not seeing the response. Even within the NGO sector, we're not seeing as many NGOs coming forward and taking up the opportunity to access that $50,000 to provide training up to a minimum of 10 persons. We aren't seeing enough survivors coming forward and accepting the opportunity to receive that scholarship opportunity of $10,000 to help you to emerge better from your situation and to advance yourself. We're not seeing enough survivors taking up the opportunity to access that $10,000 to expand the business, enhance the business, or establish a business. At the end of the day, we recognize that for our survivors to thrive and to not re-enter into situations of domestic violence, they must be financially independent and they must work towards their economic empowerment. So again, I want to use this opportunity to appeal to persons to make use of all the resources. Even a simple thing as calling 800-SAVE. Make use of the resources that your government would have put in place to help you.
Well, AG, this brings me to a recent High Court ruling where the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and the judiciary failed to exercise due diligence in protecting Samantha Isaacs. Could you shed some light on this case and say why this ruling was particularly important?
We're talking about the case of Todd Lampkin and the Attorney General. Ms. Lampkin is the mother of a young woman by the name of Samantha Isaacs, mother of a young son who was in a relationship with a young man and was being physically and emotionally abused over a period of years. And the evidence that was brought before the court shows that over the period 2013 to 2017, she made 4 separate reports to the police of serious physical assault on her by her partner, her live-in partner, and the father of their son, to no avail. The last report was made in January of 2017, and the police did nothing. And by the end of that year, she had been not just brutally beaten, but shot and killed by her partner, who in turn committed suicide. And they have left a young boy orphaned. His grandmother, the mother of the young lady, Samantha Isaacs, who was killed, brought a constitutional motion against the state in the name of Todd Lampkin against the Attorney General. And what she alleged successfully before the High Court, Justice Reginald, who is to be complimented for a very sound, well-reasoned judgment, she alleged that the right to life of her daughter had been violated. The right to life is secured by Section 4 of our Constitution. She alleged that her family life, that is to say, the right to family life of the deceased daughter, their child, and herself, the mother and grandmother, had been violated. And the right to equality of treatment had been violated. All of these are rights that are secured under our Constitution in the Fundamental Rights Provisions, Section 4 in particular. But what made the decision very significant and has it as a landmark first decision of its kind, not just in Trinidad, but I believe the entire English-speaking Commonwealth, is that the rights under our Constitution are usually enforced as negative rights, in that the state guarantees your fundamental rights from being violated by agents of the state, so that the state can't come in and do things that affect your right to life, can't come in and take your property. The state is usually the actor, and the citizen would bring a claim against the government, the state, saying that you, the government, have violated my rights. In this case, what Ms. Lampkin did was to bring a case saying that the failure of the state agencies, the police, and the judiciary to provide a protective system that would respond to 4 years of complaints by Samantha Isaacs to the police, who did not respond adequately, 4 years of being in the court system, asking for domestic violence protection orders, asking for maintenance so that she could support her son against the financial circumstances that she found herself in. The magistrate allowed herself to remark that she was questioning the motives of this young woman who was before her on a domestic court protection order as to whether she was bringing the case just to extract maintenance out of the young man who was abusing her, and he eventually killed her. And what Justice Mohammed ended up declaring is that the failure of the police and the failure of the judiciary to protect this young woman who was appealing to state agencies for protection violated her right to life, her right to family, and the right of her family, her child, and her mother to that guaranteed right to life. Because life, as Justice Mohammed pointed out, is not just a bare existence, right? The right to life is about the enjoyment, the fulfillment of life, the right to bring up your child in a safe environment. And if the state agencies fail to respond to your pleas for help, then by that failure to respond on an increasing basis and in circumstances which were quite dire and were known to the police and known to the judiciary, that meant that the state had failed her in her right to life. It's a very significant decision. It was given very recently in May of this year, and it is that decision that has prompted my ministry to decide, let us have this national consultation. As Minister Webster-Roy has pointed out, as Farzana has pointed out, we need to alert ourselves as a society to the fact that we have something taking place in our society that needs to be brought into the open. We no longer can afford to say this is just private business or be fearful of asking for intervention because we are nervous about being in the spotlight. We need the society to get up and recognize that over the centuries of our existence, we have a domestic violence challenge that is causing grievous harm to our young women, to our girls, to our men. In this case, there's a young man now who's orphaned and is going to be growing up with the gruesome reality of knowing that his mother has been beaten, his mother has been killed, and his father has killed himself. What are we as a society doing? And listening to Minister Webster-Roy, how much more can we do to help young persons and persons in the society who are the victims of this kind of abuse to get the support that they need?
You noted that there were 4 reports of domestic violence that Ms. Isaac would have reported. I understand on 2 particular cases she refused to press charges against the suspect and so on. Under the existing law, what powers do law enforcement officers have as it relates to possibly charging the abuser or the suspect without a statement from the victim?
Yes, Farzana spoke earlier about the Domestic Violence Act, which has been amended over a period of time since 1999, and there is that act, the Domestic Violence Act, there's the Summary Courts Act, there's the Criminal Procedure Act, there's the Evidence Act. We have a number of laws that allow circumstances in which even if somebody is being abused but is so afraid of the abuser that she will, having made a report, then recoil from further developing on her report and would not even go to court to give evidence. The law now allows the police or a social worker or a school teacher to lay the charges on behalf of this person who is clearly being abused, and the law allows, even where the abused person does not give evidence, the law allows the police in certain circumstances to use videotape evidence. We all have cameras in our homes, some of us. All of that can be the evidence that the police or the teacher or the social worker can put before a court, even with the victim not wanting to give evidence, so that the evidence of the fact of abuse can be brought before the court. So our laws are fairly well developed. There are a couple of areas where I think we need to think about amendments. What I think is the challenge that we are facing in our society is the culture of our reality. in the case of domestic violence, there are cultural realities that restrain and inhibit our, and by our I mean the rest of us who are not being abused, from taking action. The culture within the police system. People are turned away. Men who go to report domestic violence are not taken sufficiently seriously. Women who go to report domestic violence, I don't say this because I'm pointing fingers at anybody, but we have a culture in our society in which that's regarded as your private business, so that the police don't follow up. The police are not sufficiently proactive to use the law that gives them the power to take the initiative, and to take the initiative and to advance the complaint that has been made to them, even though the victim has recoiled and doesn't want to participate anymore. The police can take it forward. We have a culture in our society in which we almost want to pretend it's not happening, because it's a painful reality to expose, and therefore we shut our eyes to it and we allow it to happen behind closed doors and take no action at all. So more than just the laws, we need people, and this is what this consultation is about. We need to make ourselves, all of ourselves, more aware of the fact that this is a reality, this is a situation in which the society needs to help the society to wake up to the reality that we have a challenge that we need to face.
So the police in this instance can investigate further, but what I'm hearing from you is that there's a lack of, or not wanting to go forward in terms of their mindset.
Yes, in this particular case, on the last occasion or the third occasion when this young lady reported, she ran to the police station to report that she was being physically abused. The police came to the apartment that she and her partner lived in, and while the police were in the room talking to her and to the partner, he threw her to the bed and began to physically abuse her in the presence of the police. And they pulled him away and said, "Behave yourself, boy," and then they left. And within a year of that incident, she was brutally murdered by that same person. And he was never charged by the police, notwithstanding having made complaints. And there is no disciplinary action that was taken against the police, to whom the station diaries record reports were made of that quality of abuse. Now, what explains that? And I think it's the culture that pervades our lack of sufficient awareness and our lack of sufficient alertness to the fact that this is something that is not just that girl's problem or that young man's problem. This is our challenge that we need to face up to.
And Sunil, I will just add briefly that when we speak of victims unwilling to testify, it's very important to appreciate the psyche of domestic violence victims. And we cannot categorize it as victims don't want to go forward. We need to appreciate that persons are the subject of abuse, they are fearful, they may have children involved, they don't know what the repercussions are. And it's upon us, the state, the agencies, to ensure that the victim gets the required support in order to move forward. So there needs to be action by the Victim and Witness Support Unit of the TTPS. There is the Gender-Based Violence Unit that provides that type of support to ensure that victims feel comfortable enough to move forward. As it relates to the police officers themselves, I think it's very important also that in the training, police officers understand that when they go on the scene, it is to collect evidence for a prosecution of a crime. And if that is the mindset that is adopted from the start, then you would see that the police is coming to the scene, ensuring that they take a statement, capture video evidence, take photographs, speak to neighbors, and that's where the importance of the neighbors and the village comes in, because a neighbor can in fact provide a witness statement that can be evidence used in the prosecution of a matter.
You do have a significant portfolio. You are the Attorney General and the Minister of Legal Affairs. I know you're not the Minister of National Security or the head of the National Security Council, but in terms of the police, do you believe there needs to be some kind of sensitization for police to deal with such matters?
So, Sunil, yes, in answer to your question about the police are invited and are going to be part of our consultation. And as I said, I am impressed at the responses that we've been getting from that consultation, because we want everyone involved. We want not just the judges and the magistrates. We want the police to share their experiences of how they are dealing with domestic violence, separate and apart from the evidence of the particular case that we are going to be discussing, where in that case the police dropped the ball, but it's not just a question of the police dropping the ball. It's also for us to understand from the police the extent to which they are working on trying to meet this challenge. And in the Spotlight series that Minister Webster-Roy talks about, the government is working on training programs with the police to sensitize them. In relation to the schools that I've spoken about, the UN is working with the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender Affairs, to go into the schools to help persons, teachers, and others to appreciate and to understand the degree to which they can get engaged in being sensitive to and responding to issues of domestic violence.
You talked about changing the culture within the police service with regards to people reporting this and so on. We always hear the phrase, be your neighbor's keeper.
That's right.
And do you think it's high time that neighbors, if they hear of such occurrences, that they actually report it? Because as we saw with Miss Isaacs, it led to her untimely death.
One of the words that we've used in the public announcement of the fact that we are having this consultation is to say, you know, it's a village. Let's enhance our sense of community. And I'll give you a prime example of an area in which I think we could be doing a lot more by way of reacting to domestic violence. The schools. I think teachers need to recognize that they have a role to play, because the teachers will see on a daily basis young children who are coming to school. They will see the evidence, whether in terms of physical scars or the emotional scars over a period of months or years. They will see the evidence in those school classes of the fact that something is going on with this child. And the teachers have a responsibility to reach out and say, what's happening? And go and talk to the mother, or go and talk to the father. And if they don't get a sufficiently satisfactory response, the teachers, under the law that we have in place now, can make reports. So we all need to play our part.
And Minister Webster-Roy, we talk about support and so on, and we talked about shelters earlier on. Do you think the victims of domestic violence are aware of these shelters and the support that's available?
I believe that the information doesn't get to the right people at the right time, and it's only after the fact. And that is why I said that we would have started a very intense public education and sensitization effort so that all persons are aware of the resources available. So for example, partnering with TT Post, we would have distributed hundreds of thousands of booklets in every mailbox in Trinidad and Tobago, identifying the resources, the critical contact numbers that persons should know, not only for domestic violence, but also for child abuse. We have started going out and speaking to the first responders. So we've started engaging and training and empowering our local government representatives, as I would have mentioned before, partnering with the Tobago House of Assembly, working and training and empowering our assemblymen to understand their role in the communities when they go out there to help to identify and to lead support. But beyond that, the Honorable Attorney General spoke about that need for that whole of society approach, and that is why the Gender and Child Affairs Division, we would have started a united campaign where you're calling on Trinidad and Tobago to lend their voice, say, I stand united against domestic violence and all forms of violence. And that is a mantra I want each and every citizen to adopt. We must develop an attitude of zero tolerance towards all forms of violence. And I just want to point out, the AG spoke about the work that's happening with the police. Since that incident would have happened, there has been remarkable work in terms of strengthening the police service and the response there. The training that would have occurred under the Spotlight initiative would have also lent towards officers becoming more aware and also understanding their role in the response better. The establishment of the Gender-Based Violence Unit with specialized officers there would help them to be better able to treat when they approach the scene and know how to engage and to get the information. Also, the role of the judiciary is so critical, and that is why on the Spotlight, the judiciary is not left out, and that is why when we were developing the NSAP, we included the police service, we included the judiciary, we also included the media, and I want to use a special plug here. The media plays a very critical role in creating awareness and also in helping us to combat domestic violence in Trinidad and Tobago. I want to encourage media houses and media personalities to start lending their voice and their space towards the United campaign. You have a very powerful reach and a wide audience. And so for us to bring about the change in mindset, the change in culture in Trinidad and Tobago, that is required for us to get to a place of 0 instances of domestic violence. There must be a change in mindset. So while government is doing its part, while civil society is out there working on the ground, we need every sector to be able to be part of the response.
Adrian, you said the legislation for domestic violence, it's well documented. But I know you said there are also some things you are trying to get amended as well. But does that include giving officers greater powers when it comes to, pressing charges against the suspects of domestic violence and so on?
Well, I think there is first, and I go back to the point, a cultural wake-up call that we need to have for ourselves in addition to the legislative framework. And what I mean by the cultural approach is, at the moment, the legislation, the Domestic Violence Act in particular, provides for a protection order. And the approach that the police take to the report of a complaint of domestic violence is to encourage, within the framework of the Domestic Violence Act, the victim of abuse go into court for a protection order. And there are any number of conditions that can be attached to that protection order to keep the person safe from another incident. But one of the things that I don't think that the police are sufficiently alert to is that, in addition to the protection order, assault is a crime. If somebody hits another person, that is a crime. And therefore, I think that the police should be more responsive where reports are made to them of domestic violence, to recognize that that assailant, that partner in the relationship who is beaten, whether it is his female partner or his male partner, that person is already committing a crime, and you don't need to leave the victim to be protected only by a court protection order. You must charge the assailant and bring that person to court. And the evidence, as Farzana has pointed out, when the police arrive on the scene, talk to everybody, talk to the neighbors, get the circumstantial evidence, and be able to put that circumstantial evidence before a court so that the evidence sustains a charge of a crime having been committed in addition to the court protection order. So I think we need to use the law more than it is being used in its present provisions. But I also think that there will be room out of the consultation, and we're going to invite suggestions in the consultation where people feel that they are not sufficiently protected by the law. Let's get your suggestions in. We have a very strong law reform commission that researches the policy that then provides the meat on the recommendations that will go to the cabinet to approve legislative changes, which we will then take to the parliament.
Ms. Mohammed would have talked about, the victim going through certain trauma and so on. AG, in terms of, are there any repercussions if a person makes a report and then fails to follow through? Perhaps could it be classified as wasting police time?
So on your question about whether somebody can be charged with making a false report, yes, someone can be charged with making a false report. And yes, it is an offense to falsify a report and to waste police time under the Criminal Law Procedure Act, Section 6.2. But the point is, why would any police receiving a report from a victim of domestic violence, a young woman or a young man who had just been beaten, and finding that that person does not come forward to follow up, why would that police officer think that this is a situation of that person wasting the court's time? It's not. And what I think that the police must be encouraged to do in the training programs that I know are taking place now is to recognize that under the existing law, the Domestic Violence Act, the Criminal Law Procedure Act, the Summary Courts Act, the Evidence Act, There are any number of measures that are open to the police to interview the witnesses in the neighborhood, the neighbors in the village, in the community, to interview family members, in the school environment, to interview the teachers and get the circumstantial evidence that will then buttress the original complaint that was made, where that young person is now too fearful to come forward to continue with the complaint. But the circumstantial evidence from the community, the village, the school, if it is gathered by the police on the making of that first report, gives the police more than enough evidence to charge that person with a crime and follow through with it.
Do you believe it's time to revamp the system in terms of how restraining orders are granted or enforced? Because we always hear the term, we often hear people say a restraining order isn't worth the paper it's written on. And we talked about, a woman coming home, and after hearing that, she went to the police, the man probably could beat her again. And imagine if he finds out, if the suspect finds out that she actually tried to put a restraining order into place. What's there?
Well, I think that the law is sufficiently strong at the moment. We will need to look at it again carefully coming out of the consultation. I think that the judges, the magistracy, can exercise their discretion to make the protection order or to give a restraining order. I don't think it's not worth the paper that it's written on. What I think we need is, and again we go back to the culture shift that we need proactive work on the part of the police to enforce these orders, because there are lots of conditions that the judges can attach, down to the metallic bracelet, the electronic bracelet, not the metallic bracelet, the electronic bracelet. All of these are things that can be attached to the protection order, so that the monitoring of the extent to which the person against whom the protection order has been made is sufficiently thorough and robust, so that that protection order is not abused. And therefore, if everybody in the village, the police, the judges, the teachers, and the community collaborate to recognize that we are going to help that young woman or that young man to be protected, I think we will be doing enough even in the existing law. But we'll wait for the consultation. I want to emphasize it's taking place on the 25th of this month from 9 to 4 in the afternoon at the Hyatt. And we have a lot of spaces still for people to come. The registration is free. Come and participate. You're going to have the judges there, the magistrates, the police, lawyers, president of the Law Association. We're going to have a number of people there who are important stakeholders. We're going to have psychologists there. And let me talk for a minute about the psychologists. That is a very important part of the support mechanism that we need to be invoking more. Let's take an example of, and I'm not going to point to any particular case, a young boy or a young girl, 4 or 5 years of age, and his or her mother is murdered, and the father or the mother who committed the murder kills themselves. So you now have an orphan. What systems do we have in place that immediately has the police recognize that that young person is going to need help and immediately invoke psychological protection, therapy, and counseling for that young person? Do we have these systems in place now so that we immediately respond and help that young person to survive the most traumatic experience that he or she will ever have to become a healthy adult? These are the things that we need to be looking at and asking ourselves hard questions in terms of how much are we doing and how much more can we do to protect ourselves.
I'm happy that the Honorable Attorney General mentioned children, and having a space for the youth voice and the child voice at the consultation, because it's important that whenever we are developing policies that we try to capture all voices, and the voice of the child is just as important as the voice of the man or the woman. The other thing I want to point out is that in terms of the consultation and the way forward, we have a standing committee on child protection, and while that focuses primarily on child abuse, there's the connect with domestic violence. So you're seeing where government is trying to have that coordinated and integrated approach. And a key agency in that response is the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, oftentimes in instances of domestic violence where a parent might have been killed and the other parent might have committed suicide, most times we try to have the Children's Authority as well as the Ministry of Social Development and Family Service step in quickly and try to offer that psychosocial support, because one of the things that we call as core as a government is the best interest of the child. So I just wanted to reassure Trinidad and Tobago that while the government works for you, that we are cognizant of the need to ensure that our children, that their voices are heard, or youth, their voices are heard, and that at the core for business is the best interest of the child.
So we talked about victims of domestic violence refusing to give a statement or press charges against their abuser. What do you think are some of the major reasons for this?
Fear off the bat. Most times when you engage with persons who might have been in a situation of domestic violence, one of the key things that would prevent them from reporting, from seeking help, is fear of the perpetrator. The other thing is the social stigma. Sometimes Trimbigonians can be very cruel. Somebody could go to reach out for help, be brave enough to take that step, may not be to report to the police, but to report to someone else that they might think of a person as trust, and then that trust is broken. The other thing to consider is financial dependency. In situations with both men and women, if you're financially dependent on your perpetrator, not knowing where your next meal would come from, not knowing if you're going to have a place to lay your head, sometimes would prevent you from stepping forward and making the report. And then at the end of it, there's this concept sometimes that nothing going to come out of it. Nobody would see about me. If I go to the police wouldn't act. But I want to reassure Trinidad and Tobago that we recognize that there is room for improvement, but we have been taking steps towards improving all our service delivery. As we mentioned before, the training that would have occurred under the Spotlight Initiative for the police officers, the establishment of a gender-based violence unit, just to reassure persons to feel comfortable and confident to step forward and accept help. And another thing I want to mention here as well is the faith-based sector. That's something we tend to neglect. But a lot of times, persons don't report because they're looking at the family. And what would my church think? What would my pastor think? What would my pundit think? What would my imam think? What would people think if I'm going out to report on something that would ultimately put my family in a bad light? But I want to again encourage all of us, all those persons who are leaders in faith communities, to please encourage persons to know that violence in any form is wrong, that we must respect each other, we must value each other's right to live a life free from violence.
And this is where we leave it for the evening. A gentle reminder that the public consultation on domestic violence titled "The Need for Greater Protection" takes place this Wednesday at the Hyatt Regency Hotel. We will continue this discussion tomorrow right here on TTT. I am Sonolala on behalf of the entire crew. Have a great night.